So welcome to episode 27 of Breaking Bio. This is part one because we're going to be actually talking to Joshua Drew, who's in the news a lot lately, for a new paper that's awfully cool. We're going to talk to him in a second. I'm Morgan Jackson. I'm a PhD student at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. And today we also have Heidi.
I'm Heidi Smith. I'm a postdoc at the University of Texas at Austin. And actually, I'm visiting Columbia today. I'm back in New York City, so I'm close to Josh.
Worlds are colliding today, and it's coming together on Google+. So, and like I said, our special guest today is Dr. Joshua Drew of Columbia University. So you want to say hi, Josh, and tell us a little bit where you're actually speaking to us from today.
Excellent. So I am Josh Drew. I'm a lecturer here at Columbia University, and I direct the Masters of Arts in Conservation Biology program. And I am actually in the middle of class, but it's okay because it's a class on science communication. And today's topic randomly happened to be how to talk to the press, how to talk to the media. So we've had a paper come out this week, and I've been talking to a lot of the press, and I thought it would be really fun, since this is this class topic, if we did this for class. So I'm just going to turn the laptop around here, and here is my class. It is a class on science communication, and so they are watching us up on the big screen. So this is real-time science and real-time education at the same time.
So Josh, you got a new paper out that just was published yesterday afternoon in PLOS 1, sorry. Do you want to introduce a little bit about it, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it, because it's one of the cooler papers that I've been waiting to come out for a while now.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Yeah, it was a fun project. So the main gist of the paper is that we looked at shark-toothed weapons from the Gilbert Islands. So the Gilbert Islands are a small group of islands in the Central Pacific. The people there didn't have access to metal to make weapons. So being an oceanic island, they had access to a lot of sharks, and sharks are really good at cutting things with their teeth. So they actually made these weapons, daggers, knives, spears, lances, tridents, a whole array of weaponry that were festooned with shark teeth, so that the business end actually were shark teeth that were braided onto the, so they were sort of woven onto the main shaft of the weapon. So the shaft was wood, and the cutting edge was made of these different shark teeth that were sort of drilled through and woven onto the side. Now, that's really cool in of itself, but that's not necessarily a biological part. What we did, this was a team when I was a postdoc at the Field Museum with my supervisor, Mark Westney, and an anthropologist, Chris Phillip. What we did is we were able to look at the shark teeth and identify what species were present, because shark teeth, if you look at the patterns of serrations or the patterns of these buttressing elements, are identifiable to species. Now, at first, we didn't really think that there was going to be anything we could do special other than cataloging the diversity. But as we started looking through, we noticed that a couple of the species we came across were never recorded from there. So that was really interesting, because we had this interesting data from the archaeological remains or the anthropological remains, and we cross-checked that with the historical literature, and it turns out that these species had never been recorded from there. So we're interpreting that to mean that those species went extinct or were extirpated from the Gilbert Islands before anybody ever knew that they existed, before there was any sort of written record of these species being found there. And that, to me, is the real interesting part, is that we're able to identify what we're calling the shadow biodiversity. Biodiversity that you don't actually see, but you just have hints and shadows and echoes of it formerly existing. And there's no other way to do that without using these museum collections, because these collections represent sort of a biodiversity time capsule. We're able to go back in space and time and gain access to what those reefs looked like in a way that you can't do through looking at the historical literature, and you can't do now.
That's awesome. And this is exactly why I thought this paper was so cool, because you encapsulated so many different facets of biology as well as anthropology, and came up with this really neat new way of collecting data, which relied heavily, as you said, on natural history collections, which we can talk about now or later as being a little under siege right now, especially the one you did this research at. I think it's really original, and I was wondering, how did you guys come up with the idea of going down out of your marine biology corner lab and go down to the people labs and go through some of the anthropology collections, because that seems to be a bit of a stretch from normal?
Well, one of the things that I actually got when I was a student here at Columbia was an appreciation for the ability of reading into the ethnographic literature and looking at indigenous cultures and trying to figure out how they viewed the world. And Mark Westy, my supervisor, and I were talking about ways to use culturally salient species to marshal conservation. So basically, we wanted to see if a culture cared about a species enough to record it in their art or in their weaponry or in their material culture, they probably would care enough. That was probably a species that they cared about, and we might use that as a focal species or as a flagship species to help get people to help them structure their conservation programs. So we had this sort of broad idea, and we weren't really sure how to apply it. It was just something that we would talk about during lab meetings, and it was sort of like, oh, that'd be cool, but we didn't really know what the real event to spark it would be. And then I, thankfully, had a lot of job interviews last year. I was really stressed, right, because these things are really intensive, and it's a good problem to have that I had a bunch of them in a row. Like, it's way better than not having any job interviews. But it was hard because I would fly to a place, I'd spend 3 days giving 2 talks and, you know, going through a ton of meetings, and I'd come back home. I basically would have time to do like my dry cleaning, say hi to my family, and then prep for the next one. And I had a bunch of these in the row, and when I was done, I just needed something to relax because I was burnt out. I couldn't look at any more trees, phylogenetic trees. Like, I just needed to like not think about fish phylogenetics for a moment. And we had this sort of long-standing talk of like, yeah, we should look at anthropology holdings someday. And so I called Chris Phillip, who's the other co-author who works in the anthropology department, up. And I was like, hey, Chris, do you have anything cool from the South Pacific we can look at? And I had initially wanted to go through and look at the Fijian collection, and there was some stuff there, but not a whole lot. And then as we were leaving, Chris said, hey, do you want to look at some shark-toothed weapons? I was like, yeah, I mean, really? Of course you do. And he brought it out, and it was just one of those like fortuitous overlaps of bodies of knowledge, because he had a lot of information about where they were collected and when they were collected. And I had known that you could ID shark species by tooth, but I never really thought to apply it to this anthropological holdings, and he never thought to apply the biology to it. And it was just sort of us getting together and talking about it, where we had this spark, and suddenly I was like, hey, let's take a look at this in a more systematic fashion.
Awesome.
I wanted to ask, how much did the environment of the Field Museum sort of play into this coming about?
You know, it really wouldn't have been able to take place at almost any other institution, because we literally had all the data that we needed under our feet, right? So we were able to go downstairs, and we had a world-class anthropology holding that had been maintained and well curated, so we knew where we could get the stuff. But the cool part is that if I had a couple field guides that I was looking at to identify the shark teeth, but if I couldn't identify from the field guide, I could just go down another level to the ichthyology department and actually pull out the shark jaw. So if I wanted to know what oceanic white-tip shark's tooth looked like, I could actually pull out a series of jaws of oceanic white-tips, and I could take really high-resolution photographs of the shark's teeth and build my own sort of specimen vouchered field guide up to compare with the anthropology holdings one floor up. And I would just run back and forth and key stuff out that way. And if I was at an institution that didn't have a world-class anthropology and a world-class ichthyology holding under one roof, the work probably wouldn't have gone through, because you really do need that sort of intellectual mingling of people with different capabilities and access to 2 different types of collections at the same time.
Cool. So you bring up the fact that you guys, now that you're at Columbia, you've got access to another one of the great natural history museums in the U.S., the American Museum of Natural History, which is a great place. I haven't been behind the scenes yet, but I was enthralled when I walked through the galleries. I'm hoping to make it there soon. So is there any hope for doing more of this sort of thing for different areas? Are shark-tooth weapons restricted just to the South Pacific, or have they been used in other indigenous civilizations around the world where you could go back and replicate this sort of idea with a new area?
So the American Museum has a really, really good collection, and they have a new curator, a woman named Jenny Newell, who just started. And Dr. Newell's research expertise is in indigenous weapons. Which I didn't know when I came to come here. Actually, when I interviewed at Columbia, I actually stopped in to look at their shark tooth weapons before coming up as just sort of a way to calm myself down a little bit before going on this really big, important interview. And Jenny and I have plans to go through with and reinterpret some of the data with her anthropological expertise, and I'm excited to see what happens when we can crack open those holdings and see what's in there. But you did ask if other cultures had them. It's pretty common throughout many areas in the South Pacific. So some areas in Micronesia and some folks in Hawaii also have weapons, but I think that they're probably best developed in the Gilbert Islands.
Cool. Well, I look forward to future publications on shark tooth weaponry. I think it's kind of cool that there's actually somebody whose specialty is ancient weapons of various forms.
I also really like that you use them to calm down. I should think about that for meditation. Like, think of an old weapon.
Well, you know, I mean, you guys both have worked in museums. So you go in the holdings and it's dark and it's calm and it's environmentally controlled, and you just have these great things laid out in front of you, and it's a real honor and a privilege to be able to work within those museum collections. And it's just you don't worry about anything else because you're just so enthralled with the really cool things that are just laid out in front of you. So it definitely helped calm my nerves a little bit. But yeah, it'll be exciting to see what comes out. I should say I am hoping to take a master's student on, if not next year, the year after, to do some work with me on that, because there's no comprehensive field guide to the sharks of the Central Pacific, and not one that certainly includes the shark teeth. So I'm hoping I can get a student to come in and work with me to do that field guide, and then if they have an anthropological leaning, to work up the AM&H holdings as well. Cool.
Well, there's a good opportunity for any aspiring marine biologists that are happening to listening to Breaking Bio here. So I think we're almost to the end of your class. I don't want to hold your students too late. Does any of them
have to be held too late either? So.
Yeah, I'm sure they're all bustling to get back to work and get back to their research. Is there anything that anybody in the class wants to say, contribute to the podcast?
Guys, anybody want to say anything? No? They're looking forward to it, and they look like they have a deer in a headlight at this point in time. So I'll take them away from the webcam. But no, I wanted to thank you guys a lot. This has been a fun class, and I'm always trying to find ways to make the class a little bit innovative and not just sort of me droning on, because Lord knows they get enough of that. So I think they probably appreciate listening to voices other than mine at this point in time.
Awesome. Well, thanks for bringing us into the classroom today, Josh, and we'll talk to you a little bit later, and when we put the whole episode together, I'm sure we'll have quite a diverse cast and arrangement of topics to talk about. But I'd really like to thank you for taking some time in your busy schedule and your class for letting us to intrude a little bit here and do some recording for Breaking Bio and talk about your new papers. So
great. Well, thanks very much. I'll talk to you guys later.
All right. Bye, Josh.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay.
So welcome back to Breaking Bio. We spoke to Josh earlier while he was in his class, but we're going to talk a little bit more about some other stuff now with Josh. He's taken 2 days out of his schedule to talk with Breaking Bio. So what do we want to talk about now? We talked about fish biting parts. We can move on to something different now.
It's all downhill from there.
It's pretty much, yeah. I mean, it's the pinnacle of the show. This is just filler.
So I thought a cool segue would be that the fact that you actually recorded that during a class in which you teach about science communication, right? And that by itself is something that we don't see all the time. So I was wondering, like, how that got started and how it's going.
Yeah, no, it's a really fun class. It's a 2-semester class that's officially called Master's Thesis Research Development Seminar, which is quite a mouthful, but it's basically a nuts and bolts of grad school. So in the first half, all first-year master's students have to take it. In the fall semester, we deal with things about like how to pick out a committee, how to get a project that works within the constraints of a master. So basically one field season. We talk about the imposter syndrome. We talk about getting a job. Big topics that I think a lot of graduate education programs just sort of assume people will figure out along the way, and that may or may not work, but it seems like I want to put my students at a competitive advantage and at least identifying these problems ahead of time I may not have the answers, but hopefully they won't make the same mistakes that I did. You know, they can be free to make their own mistakes. So that's the first half. And the second half, which we're doing now, focuses a lot on doing science communication, because I think no matter where the students go, if it's a pre-PhD route or if it's going into a conservation NGO or working for a state or federal government, being able to own your narrative, be able to understand what it is that you're doing and be able to tell people about it is really, really important. And so we've spent a lot of time talking about different tools to have in your toolkit. So we've done stuff like taking a journal article and writing it as if it was the New York Times, taking a New York Times piece and the article that it was based on and deconstructing the Times piece to see what was selected from the manuscript and what wasn't. They've done podcasting. They're doing videos for a final. We had the CEO of Rocket Hub come in and talk about crowdfunding. And tomorrow we're actually talking about sexism in science and in science communication. And we're able to bring in a couple of people who deal with that in a professional fashion. And I'm really, really excited to be able to have a space to talk about all these different issues with, that my students, as they are learning to be scientists, deal with.
Josh, how did you sort of segue into science communication? Is it something that, because I know you from Twitter, which is
a lot of this did come out from activity on Twitter. I got into Twitter because I was awarded a grant from the MacArthur Foundation to do digital learning and communication, and we ran this project where we hooked a high school in Fiji up with a high school on the west side of Chicago when I was a postdoc at the Field Museum. And both high schools together learned about marine ecology, but we did it digitally. We made a custom social networking site for them to engage on each other with. They did blog posts, they posted videos. It was a very digital sort of environment. And as a condition of getting the grant, they wanted me to have a Twitter account. I was like, well, if you're going to give me $150,000, I suppose I can sign up for Twitter. And the things we do. And it really worked out. I sort of found that there was this whole community of people who were focused on making sure that the science that they did got out to as broad of audience as possible. And it really made me reconsider some of the activities that I've been doing and how to think about what I, as a conservation biologist, was able to do to get the narratives out that needed to be told.
Do you think that you can tell by reading a piece or, podcast or anything like that, whether it comes from a scientist or non-scientist?
If it's really bad, it probably does. But
point taken.
So one of the big things that I constantly remind my students of is that the jargon issue. We use jargon so much amongst ourselves that we don't necessarily even realize that it's a jargony word, or phrases like, across broad temporal and spatial scales. Like, as an ecologist and a phylogeneticist, that just rolls off our tongue. Like, we say that as if it's no big deal. But when people who aren't trained the way we are hear that, it's not that they don't necessarily know the words, but that is not an elegant phrase that sort of carries an intuitive meaning. And so a lot of what we've been doing is just like, I know what you mean when you say loci, but maybe you could say segment of DNA. It's the same thing, but that is an easier and more approachable way. That, I think, has been the biggest thing that we've had to hammer home. And so I guess if you see something that is incredibly dense, then it probably was written by the scientist itself.
I didn't think about that. I was more meaning like, oh, this isn't very analytical. This must not be a scientist. That shows my own personal bias, I think.
It's hard though when we had the students take an essay or take a journal article and write it as a Science Times piece. It was difficult, because getting the point across in a succinct fashion really requires you understanding it, much more so than reading the abstract and you're like, oh yeah, I kind of know what that means, but thinking critically about why that makes a difference. And it's a pretty useful exercise.
Sorry, I wanted to ask you, like, you're sort of you're out there as far as like feminism for science. You're a crusader for us, and we
for all equality.
Yeah, for all equality, definitely.
Yeah, a shining beacon in the academy for how to run a lab in an equal and honest way like that.
Yeah.
How did you
To
How
be
did you?
completely honest, my lab is basically me and 2 undergrads right now. So
Hey,
But you're fair to both of them.
I
exactly.
am, and I've got more comments. So
Right. So I'm going to take it back to the feminist part because that's what I
Okay.
do. But I wanted to, like, I would identify you as like a feminist and, you know, promoting women in science. And I think that many guys think you have to be a female to be a feminist, which is not true. Can you give some examples or things that you try to do to promote women in science, even though?
Well, I have to say, it all started. My mom was. My parents got divorced when I was very young, and my mom finished her BA, did her master's, and her PhD, all while raising me. And my mom's PhD dissertation work was looking at pay inequity between the genders in educational administration. And she has pictures of me. You know, I was born in the 70s, so she had pictures of me like little T-shirts that say "I'm a mini feminist," and I still have that shirt, and I put it on my sons too. So it's a familial thing, and you know, I've always been raised with that, and it just sort of carries through. So you know, I understand that there are significant institutional and overt challenges to women in science, and that pisses me off because we're losing half the population. We're losing brilliant minds because of systemic and actions and individual actions, and it seems like it's incredibly unfair, and it really makes me angry that we're losing these opportunities and that people can't do what they want to do because somebody is being a sexist jackass. So I should probably keep the language a little cleaner. I apologize, but you know. And you know, I don't know what I personally can do other than being a strong advocate for it. You know, I talk about sexual assault a lot, not because it's a pleasant topic, but because I feel that it's a topic that people don't talk about. And now that I'm faculty, you know, I have a little bit more of an institutional affiliation. I'm not just sort of a random guy ranting, but I have the weight of the lab behind me, and I'm careful with how I do that, but I don't regret being a strong advocate for women's rights, calling myself a feminist, and letting women know that they have and men too, you know, letting people know that they have a safe space where, you know, they don't have to deal with that. It's kind of what we're talking about tomorrow, is how coping strategies, and part of the coping strategy is finding a place where you have allies, where you can, you know, relax and talk about these things.
Right. I was talking to a female colleague, which I like to say now that I'm a postdoc, colleagues. I was talking to another female colleague the other day about this whole PyCon, like this conference, and this fiasco. And I was saying that, you know, when I was younger, I was very like women in science and these groups and all this stuff, and I still have that feeling, but I think the actions that I take are quite different. And I feel like if you just stop something, you know, if I were the woman in front of these two guys saying these things, I would just simply turn around, be like, you guys are utterly ridiculous. You should be ashamed. You know, just shame them right away and let them know. And I wish that men would speak up like that as well, because you've been at talks where the teacher's, you know, an attractive female, and someone will make a comment, and I would love it if if everyone would say something like, "Oh my God, you should just pay attention to her science." Would you make comments about the way that a man looks? Do you think women make comments about the way a man looks? Because we don't.
Yeah, and those are things that require a certain mindfulness, because there is this culture that accepts that, and that culture, you know, ultimately is you know, can lead to sexual assault, because it's a permissive culture of degrading women and of viewing them more for their physical nature than for their intellectual nature. And
Right.
because that culture is so omnipresent, you don't necessarily even, as a guy, you don't necessarily even hear it as for what it is. And I think one of the big things I challenge myself to do every day is to listen mindfully and to hear those things, and then when I do hear them, say, don't. I mean, that's not acceptable. And I don't know if that makes a big difference or not, but it's what I can do, and I hope that it helps out.
Yeah.
It is really, really a pernicious effect. And, you know, my wife is a high school teacher, and she had a student who's brilliant in math, does great in science, but scored slightly higher on her verbal GRE or SATs. And her guidance counselor said, "Oh, well, you should go into humanities because you did better in that." And no, like, if there's a woman a girl who expresses an interest in science, and she's contacting to do extra help and wants to work with my grad students. Like she clearly likes to do that. We should encourage that, and we should find ways to do that. And I really, that's one of the things that I try to do with my own lab is find ways to help women in science out and give them research opportunities.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a book called Lifting a Ton of Feathers, and it's like advice for women in academia, and there's part of it, I was reading this, and it was like, don't ever bake for your lab. Don't answer the phone. Don't plan a party. Because it puts you into these like traditional, and I did all of those things. Mm-hmm. And then I read that book. I was like, I'm not answering the phone. Yeah, man, and then in my lab we're like, can you make a birthday cake? And any boy that was like, oh, I can't make a cake. I was like, do you know where you can buy them? And it's seen cake stores before, right? But I think they're really unconscious gender roles that we fall into that have no malicious intent behind them. Because the minute someone says to you, like, come on, Raphael, I'm not bringing in cupcakes because I have a vagina, and you're like, oh, shit, sorry, and that's totally fine.
That was an actual conversation.
Speaking along those lines, and this kind of reminds me of that work that Kate Clancy just did about, and others did about sexual harassment in field situations. So when I was out in Papua New Guinea a year and a half ago or 2 years ago with Mark Westney from the field, he has 2 women grad students, and you could easily imagine the gender roles being ascribed there, right? Because they were grad students. I was a postdoc. He was a PI. They were women. We were men. I mean, it was sort of none of us are that way, but you could imagine the societal setup for that way. And I specifically assigned myself the role of cook, right? Because I liked cooking, and I didn't want to be the postdoc guy being like, woman, go cook me some food, but like it could have very easily fallen into that situation without necessarily overtly meaning to be that way. But I identified a situation that could have gone that way, and I put myself in a role to subvert those gender roles. Mm-hmm. And I like to cook. Like, there's that too. But I didn't want to add, this is their first and second field trip, and they had a lot going on, and I didn't want to also add that, like, you have to go make me food.
Right, and field work is quite tricky because you're dealing with a lot of different cultures, and yeah, it can be really complicated. But yeah, that's a good idea. Like Kate Clancy and other women who write about these issues, I absolutely admire them, but I also would never blog about it because I can't. They get so many horrible hate emails, and it honestly breaks my heart. And I always tell them when I see them, thank you for the work that you do. I could not do this. I couldn't put myself through it. But I appreciate that there are women out there.
I was actually very pleasantly surprised that I didn't get a lot of or any negative comments when I had that blog post on my own blog about sexual assault. I was ready for it, I guess, because I'm friends with Kate and like I see what she goes through. But for whatever reason, people were just really, really supportive, and many of them chose that blog as a chance to tell their own story, which I was honored, because the whole reason why I wanted to do that is that sexual assault is often invisible. People don't want to talk about it, and because they don't want to talk about it, you don't necessarily know who's survived it or how big of a problem it is. And so I wanted to show that, like, if you know a left-handed woman, you probably also know, statistically speaking, 3 survivors of sexual assault. And so I was gearing myself up for people to attack me for speaking about this issue, but instead most people were either really thankful or chose that as a venue to tell their own story, which I was really, really touched by.
We got one viewer comment, so Raphael, you want to take it away there, and then we'll let you go.
Yeah, so yeah, Guillaume, I hope I'm saying this right, but yeah, saying how taking turns cooking is the way to go. Is how it was in
absolutely, yeah. You just make it very equitable that way, and you set up a schedule, and then you don't have to worry about how people interpret that. If it's Tuesday, you're cooking, and that's that.
Yeah. Excellent advice. Well, thank you very much, Josh, for taking some time out to speak to us again, and I'm sure we'll have you on later because you got a lot going on. And
well, thank you very much, guys. This has been a real pleasure. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah, take care, Josh.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.